Utini everyone, and welcome to part 3 of the Jawa creation series. Today I'm going to show you how to assemble and sew your Jawa robe. If you haven't already watched the previous videos, you may want to go back and do that in the event that you need to dye your fabric, or if you need help with cutting out your pattern. The previous 2 videos should help you with that. As you can see, I already have my fabric laid out. This is the fabric that we dyed and then cut the pattern out of in the last 2 videos. It is folded in half, with the fold being at the shoulders, so there's no seam running along that edge. Jawa robe assembly is quite simple. It is essentially just the main body of the robe as well as the sleeves, and I'm going to show you how to pin and sew the sleeves and the rest of the robe. First thing you're going to want to do is unfold the Jawa so that the middle of the neckline is right here. This should be the top of the shoulder right here along that edge. Once you find the middle, you're going to want to lay your sleeve out against the middle. There we go. With sleeve number 1, we're going to pin this first, and then we'll do the other side, and then I'll show you how we sew it. So I said pins, but I actually prefer to use these little clips, because if you've never worked with monk's cloth before, you may not know it is a very heavy fabric. And pins, since it's also a very loose weave fabric, sometimes pins will come loose, but these little clips, they hold tight, but not too tight that you're going to get a run. And they really do hold it well, and I would recommend getting these. I'm going to put a link to where you can buy these online in the description below in case anyone's interested. So essentially what right now we are looking at is the inside of the Jawa robe itself. So we want to pin the sleeve to the robe like this. You're gonna pinch it like that so that you have it together, and then we're gonna pin right there. All right, now that this side is pinned or clipped, I'm gonna do the same to the other side, and then we'll be ready for sewing. I did just want to mention that, as you can see, I have pinched this together, and then I've clipped it, and then we're going to be sewing just along the edge of these clips, so it gives us our seam allowance already, which is really nice. All right, now that both sides are pinned, we're going to sew the sleeves in place. What I'll be using for this project is going to be the same as when we were doing our zigzag stitch in the very first video that I made. Coats Extra Strong, the upholstery thread. It's the strongest thread that I've used on this project, and it is quite thick. It works really well, and it's very sturdy and is resistant to a lot of snapping of seams and things like that. So I would definitely recommend an upholstery thread. If not this exact brand, Coats & Clark, then I would definitely recommend any upholstery thread, because it's going to be the sturdiest that you're going to find. If you don't remember from last time, I'll go ahead and show you again. Whenever you sew monk's cloth, the first thing you're going to want to do is to make sure that your machine is on the zigzag setting. So mine is number 1, and then I want it to be the tightest zig that it can be. So I'm going to go ahead and just move it to about a 4 or a 5. Also, another little quick tip, sewing yards and yards of monk's cloth is rather difficult. So what I would recommend is putting your sewing machine on a table where you have some length to lay out part of the monk's cloth. That'll reduce any tugging on your sewing needle, and it'll also reduce any snapping of the thread or snagging of the monk's cloth while you're sewing. Some snagging is expected, and it's going to happen, but as long as it's not a major snag, it actually adds to the character, and you can think of it as accidental weathering. General rule of thumb, and especially when sewing the monk's cloth, because it does tend to fray, you're going to want to sew in a few stitches and then reverse your machine and sew back a few stitches as well. And that way you have a nice anchor for your sleeve. There's the anchor, and as you can see, it continues on along, and I'm going to just sew along the rest of the seam here. Remember at the end of your seam to put a little back stitch in it as well, so that you can anchor the sleeve on this side. Once that sleeve's done, flip it over, and we're going to sew the other side as well. All right, with the sleeves attached, you can fold it back in half again, matching these seams with these seams. Sorry, it's a little messy down there. I haven't straightened that part yet. But essentially what you're going to do now is you're going to sew along these edges, and only these edges. Those are the only approvable seams for the 501st. along with these sleeve seams here. If you have a small enough person, you can get away with having no seams here if you're small enough. I'm 5 foot and I'm not even small enough for not having sleeve seams. So you'll definitely want to measure it. Make sure that you have enough fabric to go down to the middle of your hand, kind of like my sleeve is right here. If you do and can get away without any seams right here and can just cut the fabric out of the or cut the pattern out of the fabric rather, then go right ahead, but I would always recommend sleeves if you can. So essentially what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pin along these seams here and then sew the robe together. As you can see, it's already starting to look like a robe. By this point, you should be getting pretty excited because look, you have a Jawa, essentially. Almost there. Remember at the beginning of the sleeve to go forward for a few stitches and then to reverse your machine so that you put an anchor at that point, because this will be a fray point that we're going to hem around, and I'll show you how to do that later. But we want to make sure that this part of the sleeve, which is going to be down by the wrist, is anchored and secure for when we start wearing it, because that's going to be it could get caught on something, and the last thing you want to do is for it to pop a seam. All right, we're coming upon a junction, and an area that I cannot stress enough that needs reinforcement is going to be the armpit. So what I'm going to recommend doing is when you get, so here's the bottom of the arm and then it comes down this way for the rest of the robe. What I'm going to recommend is coming over this armpit junction and then going back over it and then coming over it again. So essentially we're doing 3 rows of stitches over this armpit, because this is going to be a source of tension when you're lifting your arms, when you're, just picking up stuff, when you're goofing around in your costume. And so the last thing you want to do is to pop this seam. And as you can see, this does fray quite easily. Thankfully, the zigzag stitch stops it, but I really want you to focus on reinforcing this armpit. Now I'm gonna go ahead and trim some of this away so that it doesn't get caught in my sewing machine, but definitely reinforce your tension points. So your armpits, if you need to, the tops of your shoulders, but the armpits specifically, just because it's 4 pieces of fabric meeting in one spot. So we definitely want to reinforce this. All right, so I've gone over it one time. I'm gonna put my machine in reverse and I'm gonna go back over it again and then sew forward and then continue the rest of the way down the robe. I do want to say that if a snag does happen, because bad snags can happen to good people, don't worry, stop sewing, and with the piece that has a tiny snag, just lightly pull at the material on either end, and it'll usually make the snag a little bit less noticeable, and then it should mesh in with the rest of the material. As you can see here, there's a lot of give to this material because it's very loosely woven. So you have a little bit of forgiveness with it. Again, don't panic, just give it a little bit of pull. You can kind of see right here where there was a snag, but I went ahead and just tugged on it a little bit and it straightened out. Also, I'm almost at the end of the robe here. Remember, when you get to the bottom or to the end of any stitch, that you want to do a little bit of reverse to anchor that in. All right, now that the robe is completely sewn down both sides, what we're going to want to do is to put the fray hem in the sleeves and the bottom of the robe, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So basically, this is one of the sleeves. While the robe is still inside out, you're going to want to put measure in about a ½ inch into the sleeve, and then you're going to do a zigzag stitch around the entirety of the sleeve, and that way you have you can pick this and you'll have that little ½ inch fray that's according to the CRL. So I like to start at the base of the sleeve, and what I do is it's sewn together like this. I like to lay it flat like that and then put it on the machine so that the hem is laid flat before putting down the foot. And then you can see I've got that about ½ inch in, and then we'll be able to sew around it. Now keep in mind, if your fray looks a little bit long, you can always trim the fray. So let's get sewing. All right, sleeve 1 is done. I'm going to now do this same hem to the other sleeve and the bottom of the robe. All right, now that the entire robe is sewn, it's ready to cut the neck hole. Now, remember, we want to cut this rather small. We did measure it out. I think it's on the other side of here. If the chalk hasn't all worn off, you can see it faintly. We're gonna go ahead and cut a neck hole in it. Again, remember, if it doesn't look big enough, don't worry. We're also going to be cutting a slit in it that we're going to add a snap to so that it closes. All right, I have cut my neck hole, but now I need to cut a slit here so that I can add a snap so that we can close the hole that you stick your head through. It doesn't have to be a very large slit, but you do have to cut it down at least 2 inches. So once you do that, what we're going to do now is we're going to do the same zigzag stitch that we did along the edges of the sleeves and of the robe, and we're going to zigzag stitch around this hole opening here to seal it off from fraying too much. All right, as you can see, I have done a zigzag stitch twice around the entirety of the neck hole and slit. I made sure to reinforce this bottom part because this is going to be a hard line that could eventually fray down. So if you reinforce this spot right here, it's going to be stronger in the long run. Essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be sewing a snap right here so that this can snap over top of it, and we'll make that neck hole not as large, and you'll still be able to get your neck through it. So you can lay out your snap that you're going to want to use for this neck piece, and if you need to, you can mark it out with chalk so that you know exactly where you want to sew it. You're going to want to really attach these snaps because a lot of the weight of your robe is going to hang on these snaps, and that's why I prefer these large ones because they are very, very sturdy. They don't really go anywhere, and they're pretty strong. So if you need to, you can mark out with chalk where each part of the snap will go, and then you'll start sewing them on. Now, unfortunately, this is a hand sewing portion, so take it slow. There are some YouTube tutorials on how to hand sew buttons and snaps on, so if you're not sure, you can always look that up. Alright, now that you've sewn your snaps on, you're essentially done with the robe construction. The robe itself is pretty much done. The only thing that you're going to want to do now is along these edges, like the neck, the sleeves, and the base of the robe, you're going to want to pick at these frays. Get all of this excess long stuff out of the way, cut it down until it's just a nice fray, a nice clean fray I should say, and then it shouldn't be any longer than 1/4 of an inch. So if you have 1/4 to 1/2 inch, I'm sorry. So if there is any fray that's longer than that, you're going to want to trim it down. Forewarning, this is very messy, so you're either going to want to do it outside or make sure that you have a trash can or a vacuum available at all times. After you've picked your frays, you can turn the robe right side out, and then you'll see here we only have those few seams going along the edges, and it's a nice clean robe. Essentially, you've just made a Jawa. Good job! Join me in the next tutorial on how we're going to make the hood for this robe.